Today is Wednesday, January 14th, 2015. Man, it's like we're living in the future. And this is episode 101 of the Defensive Security Podcast. My name is Jerry Bell, and joining me tonight, as always, is Mr. Andrew Callett.
Good evening, Mr. Bell.
Good evening.
And it's really my fault that we're 2 days late, so I'm sorry.
It's quite all right. We will rectify that going forward.
New jobs and all that keep me crazy busy.
Yep. So, before we jump into stories, just a reminder, the thoughts and opinions we express on this podcast are ours and not those of our employers, past, present, or future.
It's true.
So, first story we have tonight comes from the Wall Street Journal, and the title is Puzzle Forms in Morgan Stanley Data Breach. We talked a little bit about this one last week, but since then, some additional information has come to the surface, first of which is that we now have a name for this insider. Apparently, it's Galen Marsh. And allegedly, Galen Marsh stole 350,000 of Morgan Stanley's records. Customer records, I should say. However, interestingly, he admits to stealing, or I use the word stealing in quotes, right? He admits to copying them. However, he does not admit, he denies that he posted them online or offered them for sale as this thing initially came out. So it's kind of an interesting turn of events, particularly that this article here points out that he doesn't really have a whole lot of apparent motivation. You know, he has been rising through the ranks. There's no indication of performance problems, so it's not like he was about to be apparently let go. So kind of an interesting case. But another interesting point is that apparently Morgan Stanley is taking some relatively drastic measures to clamp down on the amount of data people have access to, which I think is probably a good thing. I know last week we didn't offer a lot of advice, but I was thinking about that over the week, and some things that I've seen done and I have done in the past is really to take a look at your business process when you have a data repository like this that has sensitive things, and look for opportunities to basically implement some kind of an interlock so that people only have access to records they should have access to. I think, given what I'm reading here, it sounds like that's what they're doing. And the other interesting thing was they found this person by looking at a report of who had accessed the couple. I think it was about 1,000 records, if memory serves, that were posted to Pastebin. They looked to see who had accessed those records, and apparently this was the only person who had done that. So they clearly had the technology to do that, and it makes me wonder, why would someone accessing 300,000 records not trip a proactive alarm?
Yeah, that is a good question. And one thing I find interesting as well is that a couple things here. So let's say for a moment, just for the sake of discussion, Galen is innocent. I think it's very often the case that employees grab data to work on at home, or to do something else with it, or to do something that is within their job duty but is outside the normal mechanism of the way that that data was meant to be accessed. So let's say we don't know exactly what he did, we don't know why, but let's say for a reason he thought that he had a reason to grab those 350,000 accounts or records of information to do something. and for whatever reason, wanted to work on it at home. And threw it out on Dropbox and then grabbed it on his home box. Who says the bad guys weren't somehow watching or already on his home box as a matter of course, saw this really interesting data, grabbed it, and started selling it?
That is exactly the thought that crossed my mind. So just to continue the story a little bit, apparently Morgan Stanley's security, obviously they confronted him and he admitted to it, and in fact, he went home with their security people and turned over some of his personal devices, which
I thought that very odd.
Yeah, well, I will tell you a story about Bob sometime.
All right.
It's not as unheard of as one might think, but in any event, this Galen submitted apparently a personal computer and a personal device. It's not clear to me if it was a USB device or what, that had allegedly copies of the customer data. And I think, if I had to guess, and if he wasn't the originator, I would suspect that what you just described is in fact the case. The other thing that where my head went was, blackmail or, some other means by which someone else had cajoled him into copying the data. So
that's possible, but you think he would? I don't know.
I don't know. Don't really know. The other interesting thing was they pointed out that, at least for the purposes of this article, they were kind of scratching their heads as to how this person actually copied the data, because apparently Morgan Stanley's is relatively locked down and apparently doesn't allow USB devices and things like that. So there's not a lot of detail on how he copied it. I would expect that they don't allow access to Dropbox, so he may have gotten a little clever. And I do wonder about things like Bluetooth file sharing to your iPhone and stuff like that. So, that's one of the problems and I've struggled with this a little bit in my own career. How do you stop the bleeding? Because there's just so many avenues that data can leak off of a person's computer.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, too, that they were able to go back and look at the records of who accessed the data when they knew what to look for.
Yes.
So it makes you wonder, okay, is there an opportunity there then to build a proactive alerting system when certain thresholds are crossed in terms of how much data is accessed? And this seems to be the case a lot, that we can go back and find that signal in the noise, to quote the book that you made me read, when we know what we're looking for, but we're not so great at spotting it as it's happening. And that's something I think we can get better at.
I suspect so. And I gotta believe, now granted, I don't know the first thing about their business process, but I will bet you that it's not very common for people to access more than a couple of records at a time. Or maybe it's if there are people, it's relatively specific job roles or what have you. But it just seems odd to me that they had the capability to go and do that analysis and they weren't already looking at it. But I don't know. There may be more nuance that we're not aware of.
Indeed.
All right, so moving on to our next story, and this one comes from The Economist, and it is called "Losing the Plot." It's a bit of an obtuse, relatively short story, and I think at the time it was written, it was January 3rd. It was I guess a little prescient in that it forecasted, I think, what ended up happening or is going to happen in the U.S. with some proposed legislation around information sharing and requirements around reporting breaches and things like that. But essentially the point of this article is that we hear about the exceptions. We hear about the Home Depots, the Targets, the J.P. Morgans, the Morgan Stanleys, because for whatever reason they can't. Those companies can't contain the release of that data. It's public. Brian Krebs has already written about it. It's out there, and they've got to deal with it. But the point of this article is that for every one of those, there's an untold number that we don't hear about. And because of that, we don't, in general, the industry doesn't have the opportunity to learn from, all of those breaches. And so the proposition here is that, boy, we should be making companies, organizations who are breached do some kind of mandatory reporting, I guess, to some kind of government entity. And, I'll tell you, I'm of two minds on that, because on the one hand, I see a lot of utility in having that kind of information available in many different venues, But on the other hand, I think there's a lot of downside to requiring that, And they pointed out too, it would probably lead to knee-jerk reactions by, government regulators and things like that. So, it's an interesting debate, and I think it's really going to start coming to a head given what the president of the U.S. is about to propose.
Yeah, this is a tough one for me. I kind of am going back and forth on this, but in essence, this concept keeps coming up over and over again. We just need more information. We need to share more information. We need to talk more. If we could just learn from others. Over and over, this has come up. I'm going to be cynical for a moment and say, I see so many companies that have had the lessons available to them for years and years that they still don't get right. Basic IT security hygiene failed over and over again. Right? So they're not even getting the basics down. But let's go forward past that and say, all right, we do think this is valuable. We keep trying this. This is what all the ISACs are for in all the various different industries that are supposed to be private information sharing, open the kimono with only vetted people who can share information and learn from each other. Don't know if anybody's done any research on how useful that has actually been in preventing breaches. But the other thing I'll say that comes to mind is in the aviation world, we have something interesting. It's a form. It's actually a NASA form that when something happens, it's kind of a get-out-of-jail-free card in some ways. The concept is if you self-report some sort of safety incident, violation of regulation, something amiss happened, if you self-report it to NASA, which goes to the NTSB and the FAA ultimately, it can absolve you of a lot of liability in that incident. Not forever and not perfectly. But the concept is if you share the lesson learned, it reduces your legal liability in whatever happened. Mm-hmm. And the way it's set up in the aviation world is you have to do that before the FAA comes knocking on your door, right? So before they start doing some sort of enforcement action. I'm not describing this perfectly, but I'm describing it for enough to say that in that particular environment, they've built an incentive for people to be honest and open and learn from to prevent accidents and other issues elsewhere in aviation. So the only way I think this would likely work is if you could do something along those lines where if a company is self-reported, they could absolve themselves of a certain level of, breach penalty, perhaps. Mm-hmm. Don't know. Just throwing it out there as a thought. But I don't know that this actually is the panacea everybody thinks it is to share all the information.
I don't think so. And I think there's two. This is a two-sided coin, because on the one hand there is the desire to share with others in the industry, right? And so that's I think what CISPA and some of the other bills have been focused at doing. I mean, obviously they're much more contentious than that, and I don't mean to be underplaying that aspect, but I guess the point is that there is a push on to enable companies, let's say, who would otherwise be competitive with each other, to share information and not, not fear for whatever reason that they're going to be, they're going to be subject to some kind of anti-competitive, enforcement action by the government. And so I think, that's obviously something that is underway, and I think the ISACs are intended to help with that for sure, and there's lots of other bodies, but then there's also this other requirement which basically says, if you get breached, you're going to end up having to go report that to the government, and they make a bridge to something else that is in place right now with financial institutions. When a financial institution, either through IT or physical kinetic attack, has suffers a loss, they have to report that to the regulator.
Right.
So it's mandatory. So what they're basically saying is, well, maybe that should be the model that is used, because let's face it, banks. Stuff happens all the time to banks, and and presumably that is flowing into the regulators as it's required by law to happen, and it doesn't get published out. I think the point is that there's still some level of confidentiality that happens there. When that happens, I'm not exactly sure what the benefit is. I suspect that if we were to fast forward in a parallel universe where that was in place, some period of time, you may see laws that say, well, we're seeing an awful lot of breaches that happen as a result of X, Y, and Z, and so therefore we're going to impose some kind of either incentive or penalty for companies who do X, Y, and Z wrong. So anyway. More to come there.
Yeah, it's an interesting problem. The other thing I'll say, and then we can move on, is I'm not a huge fan of the patchwork of breach reporting laws in all the different states. I think that makes life really difficult. I'm not a huge fan of federal law, but in this case, it seems like it makes sense to go at a federal level to deal with this.
I will say, given the proposal, that at least the one that I read, there were many aspects of the proposal, but at least that particular part, I do think would make, assuming that it superseded all the state level breach reporting requirements, I do think that would dramatically simplify the whole breach reporting problem, right?
Yep.
Because now if you're a company that does business with residents of every one of the states, there are 47 different laws, 47 different breach laws. You got to notify. Generally, it requires you to notify the state attorney general, and other stuff. So it's a difficult thing, and it's constantly changing and whatnot. So you're right on. So moving on to our next story, this one comes from Security Week, and the title is Google Discloses New Unpatched Windows 8.1 Privilege Escalation Flaw.
And pisses off Microsoft to no end in the process.
That's right. So we normally don't talk about stuff like this, but I thought this was an interesting discussion, because this is the second time. This is not the one from December, right? This is a new one. This is the second time in a month that Google has stuck their thumb in Microsoft's eye over a privilege escalation flaw in Windows 8. And I, personally, I had thought the whole debate over vulnerability disclosure had ended a long time ago, but I guess I was wrong. And so this has really whipped up a bit of a frenzy, because now we have Microsoft saying, oh my gosh, Google, you're killing us, you're killing our customers, because, we told you we were going to patch it on the 15th, and you went ahead and decided to disclose it on the 13th. And, in that particular case, I think this one was 2 days. The last one was month, I think.
Well, Google's side of that is, hey, we have a 90-day clock,
Exactly.
and we don't change it for anybody.
Right.
So we gave you 90 days to patch it,
Yeah.
and you took 92. Sorry.
Right. Right. It's not a surprise. And, it's a tenuous problem because if you go back a number of years, and even to some extent, we still see it today, especially in the industrial control space, where vendors try to just sit on it forever. They really don't want to address it a lot of times. And we've seen actually, I think it was last year, somebody had a vulnerability in some. I think it was a badge reader, or I don't remember exactly what it was, but they sued to have this person not present their findings at a security conference. And that's kind of the thing that the vulnerability disclosure policy is intended to countermand. Basically, we told you that it's 90 days, period. We're not, you can fix it or not fix it. And it's, if your customers are at risk, that's on your head, not ours. So,
Yeah, it's a tough one. And if we, abstract this out for a moment, it's a conversation I was having today with someone around vulnerability management isn't just applying patches. There are times when there are vulnerabilities out there that we don't have patches for. So how do you deal with that as a company? You've got to have a methodology.
Absolutely.
Now that may be, all right, we've got some sort of compensating control we can wrap around it. Maybe we've got, let's just say it's a web vulnerability. Well, we've got a WAF in front of it that we can tweak to stop it. You've got to realize that there's other things to care about other than just, well, there's a patch, we got to throw a patch out there. There's going to be times, especially with the 0 days, where we're not going to have a patch. So I think this exposes, again, that discussion in this case. And, Google's point, and I'm actually, if you had to put a gun to my head, it's a tough one because I don't disagree with Microsoft's position that, hey, we should do a coordinated release when a patch is available. Google's position is we have to force people to be more responsive. And we can't allow these known vulnerabilities to just sit out there forever because if we found it, maybe somebody else found it.
Exactly.
And I think that's fair, right? I also think it's highly likely there's a whole bunch of 0 days out there that the bad guys know about that the good guys don't. So it's a tough one. And I don't know who... I think if I had to choose between the two positions, if I had to choose, I'm leaning ever so slightly towards Google on this one.
Yeah, I'm firmly in Google's camp.
But it's a tough one. It's a tough situation. But it does, again, to recap, point out, we as defenders need to have methodologies to deal with vulnerabilities when we don't have patches. And we saw it over and over last year with Heartbleed, with Shellshock, with others. So if your patch management is the only way you deal with vulnerabilities, that's probably not going to serve you well going forward.
That's true. That's true. And by the way, I think it's also worth pointing out that Microsoft yesterday on Patch Tuesday, I think, if memory serves, they patched 4 local privilege escalation bugs, and I don't believe this one was one of or no, this was one of them, but the other one wasn't. I think the other one's not scheduled to be patched until February. So that's. I agree with you, and the other issue I see, and I guess it's tangential to this, is that a lot of organizations I don't think take local privilege escalation bugs all that seriously. And I think that's very detrimental. And so we often think about things in terms of remote code exploits and things like that. But for what you just said, having some kind of mitigation plan in place, in my mind, that extends to this kind of thing as well. So, and not in not every case you have to worry about that, right? You need to have your own ability to determine whether or not it's a significant problem for you. But you do need to make that evaluation, and if it's if there's code out there and you feel like you're exposed, you need to have a way to mitigate it.
Hopefully, or at least be mindful of the situation.
Yeah. That's right. So moving on to our next story. This one comes from the Cult of Mac, which is not a security site. And the title is How Sloppy Security Exposed Apple's Super Secret Product Plans.
This is just bad.
Yeah. So I actually learned some things that I didn't know about the Apple Watch, the iWatch, from this article. So the story here is that a company called Quanta Computer, which is based out of Taiwan, who is an OEM manufacturer for a whole bunch of different computer makers, right, including Apple. Well, apparently their database, they have a database that is somehow accessible from the internet, and they publish. This part's not exactly clear to me, right? But there were documents, I presume PowerPoints, circulating around the internet, which had login credentials to get into their database. And worse than that, their customers were set up with accounts, and apparently all the accounts had similar or the same default password, and I guess nobody, who changes the password, right? That's crazy.
Crazy talk.
So yeah, people apparently have been walking out with plans for Apple products, and that's really, if you're a company like Apple, I mean that's your secret sauce, is your product roadmap. And as I was mentioning, one of the things I didn't know is the day before Tim Cook did his big Dog and Pony show introducing the iWatch, somebody posted on Reddit diagrams and information about the iWatch that they had stolen from this site.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Oy.
And this kind of comes back to something we've been talking a lot about, which is vendor management. And you are in many ways beholden to the security of your vendor. And this is a little bit different take on some of the recent discussions we've had, because it wasn't that Quanta was a vector into Apple's network. It was that Apple had transferred intellectual property to Quanta, who was storing it on their own systems, and it was just apparently wide open to the internet. So that, I think, put that into your vendor management pipe and smoke it, right? But one of the other things, and I've talked about this long ago, I want to bring it up again. Search Google for your confidential information. If you tag your documents with some kind of your name and confidential or something like that, put that in the Google, set the file type to PowerPoint or Word doc, and go see what you find out there, because I bet you're going to be a little surprised.
This is also a great point, or a great time to bury some sort of, there's a term for it, I don't know what we decided to call this, but some sort of unique identifier in your proprietary information. Whether it's a fake entry into a database, whether it's something that is unique, easily searchable, use it to trigger DLP, use it to trigger anything looking for unstructured data that shouldn't be where it shouldn't be. This is another great example of it, where you can actually bury some sort of fake honey data out in your stuff and then go look for it and see where it's at and where it shouldn't be.
Yeah, to basically tag it with some unique identifier that lets you go back and look for it.
But that looks like legitimate data, so it wouldn't necessarily be stripped.
True. Good point.
Yeah.
Good point. So yeah, that's I think the long and the short of it. Total unadulterated fail on the part of the vendor.
Well, it's a good example of if you are handing off proprietary secret data to a third party, you might want to spend some of your resources going and checking out that third party.
Yeah, especially if you're Apple, and especially if your business hinges so much on
I think Apple probably could have devoted an FTE to
maybe
to this problem. I think
maybe. Although
I mean, it's tough with all the suppliers they've got to work with. It's tough.
Oh, absolutely. But at the same time, I've long, and now I'm straying way off the path, right? But I've long wondered if Apple is not the beneficiary of some of their leaks. I really think they have become a master at building buzz. I'm not saying that this was part of that, but I'm not saying that it didn't help them either.
Perhaps unintentionally at times, perhaps intentionally. I can see that.
Yeah, I mean, how many times have we found? How many times have iPhones been left at bars, right?
But at the same time, I really do think Apple legitimately, from everyone I've talked to who works at Apple, is legitimately incredibly concerned with their security of their intellectual property.
Oh yeah, I'm not disputing that.
They are absolutely notorious in the industry for that. So I do think some of these are just Charlie Foxtrots that, because they are so epically known for their security, when they do screw up, it is front page news.
Yeah, for sure. And if you are going to invest that much in security, you really need to be looking at this too. So anyhow, moving on to our last story, which comes from Network World. And this is a really interesting, kind of subtle story that I don't think's gotten a ton of news. So the headline here is: hackers dump over 30,000 confidential client emails after bank refuses to pay ransom. So there's a Swiss bank named BCGE, and it stands for something, and I'm not even going to try to say it. Apparently was being blackmailed or ransomed by a hacker group, and I'm trying to find the name of the hacker group. Rex Mundi is the name of the hacker group. I suppose that means something to someone. They leaked. I think they leaked a small number of emails, if memory serves, and they had right around 31 or 30,000 emails, and they had ransomed, or they had demanded a ransom out of BCGE for 10,000 euros, which is not a ton of money. And they kind of go on to say that this Rex Mundi has a reputation of quantity and not quality, so to speak. Their reputation is that they would rather ransom 10 different companies $10,000 each than one company $100,000, because they will get companies to pay $10,000. It's apparently there's a pain threshold beyond which people don't want to pay, but
yeah, we've talked about this like with CryptoLocker and CryptoWall, right? They find that sweet spot.
Yes, exactly. So the bank here kind of thumbed their nose at Rex Mundi, and Rex Mundi, true to form, did in fact drop the emails, and I think they posted some kind of cute email saying, we hope that you're referring to the bank's customers. We hope that your tax records are in order, or you enjoy your tax audit or whatever, but not realizing that they're already passing that information to global governments. Anyhow, that the days of Swiss bank secrecy is, well, let's see, that's 13 years past now. So 14 years past. But in any event, the story here to me is twofold. Number one, the bank is completely downplaying the importance of these emails. Basically, saying, it's a non-issue. Yeah, these emails were put out there. It's old stuff. Nothing personal. And I find that offensive, on the one hand. The other is, how do they steal these? And there's not a lot of detail, except there are a number of references that apparently some number of servers run by BCGE were hacked, and this apparently where the data was stolen from. So, and there's no reference to that. The bank says that they took no corrective action. They didn't find anything that they needed to do differently. And I just find the whole response really odd. And I don't know if it's a cultural thing with the Swiss or what, but it's a very odd situation to me.
It is. I applaud them for not paying the ransom.
Yeah, I agree.
And I've read a couple of articles where they kind of said, look, we're not going to give into this. We're going to be completely open and transparent, and we're going to, just deal with what comes, because we're not going to feed into this methodology of making business by the cyber criminals. So I somewhat agree with that, at least. But yeah, there's a lot of other oddness here, and maybe this has something to do with perhaps regulations in Switzerland too. I don't know.
Yeah. I just find the way they're downplaying the data that was stolen and the servers that were hacked it just is odd to me. And apparently this group has also been known to be attacking a bunch of other companies, including Tabasco, Z-Staffing, Exeris. Let's see, the temporary staffing agency Extra Interim, and they also tried to blackmail Domino's. So I think we actually talked about Domino's several months ago, when I think they had stole 650,000 records. They stole a bunch of records and they were blackmailing Domino's.
That seems a lot more work than just doing DDoS extortion, which apparently seems a lot easier and probably just as likely to make them money.
Or CryptoLocker.
Yeah, seriously. Not that I'm trying to tell them what to do here, not giving them ideas.
Just a lot of work. It's just a lot of work. But so maybe there'll be more to come. But the reason I brought this one up, I found their response to be very odd, and I also found the media's lack of really pressing into that interesting. We see with Sony or Target or Home Depot, pitchforks and torches being raised, and here's this yawner. Swiss bank gets hacked and doesn't pay the ransom. There's anyway. I just find the whole thing really odd. I guess I'm throwing rocks at the media.
But not all the media. We like a few of them.
That's true.
Like Brian Krebs, we're big fans.
Absolutely. We got to get this on his radar. So yeah, that is episode 101. It's a little abbreviated because we're both tired, and I think next time we'll get back on to our normal track.
Yeah, we might move our recording day to a better day, I think.
Indeed.
But thanks for sticking with us through my little job transition here. And once I get used to getting up early and driving to work every day, I'll be fine.
Yep, your days of slacking are over.
It's good working with proper villains again, though. I'll tell you that.
Fair point. All right. Well, I appreciate everyone listening, and if you have any thoughts or opinions or comments, send us an email to info@defensivesecurity.org. You can find the links to the stories we talk about on our website at www.defensivesecurity.org. You can find the podcast on Twitter at DefensiveSec. You can find Mr. Callett on Twitter at Lurg, and me on Twitter at MaliciousLink. And with that, we will talk again next week. Take care.
See everybody.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. Bye.